Hi everyone, how are you doing? Today I'm going to talk about my 10 favorite books that I've read so far this year, and what a year it's been, right? I mean, back in January, I don't think any of us would have imagined what a challenging and difficult time this year would be. And while time at home might seem ideal for bookworms, I know a lot of us have really struggled to read much during this time for a whole variety of reasons. And I found it difficult as well. But when I have been able to sit down and really concentrate on a good book, the inspiration and solace I've found from fiction has been more important than ever. So I'm thrilled to talk about these 10 different novels with you, and I'm really keen, as always, to hear about your favorite books that you've read so far this year. So let me know about them in the comments below. I'm not ranking any of these books that I'm talking about. I'm just going to discuss them in the order that I've read them this year. First, I have a book I read all the way back in the beginning of February, Love and Other Thought Experiments by Sophie Ward. You could call this a book of short stories or interlinked short stories, but it's primarily about a couple named Rachel and Eliza, whose desire to have a child results in unforeseen circumstances. The book is framed as a series of thought experiments considering different conceptual and philosophical ideas. And I know that sounds way too cerebral for fiction, but honestly, it is so entertaining and engaging how it explores the emotional consequences of following different life paths to competing and dramatic conclusions. It is so creative and extraordinarily unique, like no debut I've read before. Weather by Jenny Offill. Now, my favorite book of last year was Ducks Newburyport. Yes, it is 2020 and I'm still talking about the Ducks. But I think Weather is kind of like a heavily condensed version of Lucy Ellmann's novel in the way that they both explore modern day anxieties about politics and the environment with a sort of humorous edge to them. You know, there'll be a line in this novel that says, "Today, NASA discovered 7 new Earth-sized planets." So there's that. You know, it has that kind of funny edge to it. And the novel has this extraordinary way of building a much larger world view through these snapshots of experience. It's a skillfully abbreviated view of one woman's reality, and I can't resist a novel that has as its heroine a librarian. So this novel is currently shortlisted for the Women's Prize, and I know this may be a controversial view, but I think it has a good chance of winning. Hurricane Season by Fernanda, Melchor, and translated by Sophie, Hughes. A notorious individual referred to as the Witch is found dead in a body of water in a Mexican village, and through a series of accounts we get a portrait of both the victim and the larger masculine-dominated community. There's an intensity and propulsion to this story which I found so hypnotic, and it made it really hard to put down. Through the momentum of the characters' voices, we see the complexities and contradictions of people who appear simply villainous on the surface, and it feels like this book was heavily influenced by Gabriel Garcia Marquez in his style of writing that's almost journalistic or a documentary style of telling a story from a variety of perspectives until the meaning of truth is completely obliterated. It's so powerful, and this book is also shortlisted for the Booker International Prize, and yes, I think it has a very good chance of winning. The Illness Lesson by Clare Beams. This novel is set in the 1870s in New England at a newly established private girls' school founded by Samuel, who has some very experimental ideas about how education and community should work, almost from a transcendentalist point of view. But the story focuses on Carolyn, who works as a teacher at that school, and things go wrong. They go so wrong. It's very suspenseful. All the girls get a mysterious illness, and the story goes to some very dark places, but it's really fascinating what it says about complicity and sexual abuse. I think the author also uses some incredible imagery with strange red birds that periodically appear. It's very smart and movingly done. The The Eighth Life by Nino Haratischvili, translated by Charlotte Collins and Ruth Martin. Yes, it took me a very long time to read this very long novel, but it was so worth it. Just enthralling, fascinating, beautiful storytelling about multiple generations of a Georgian family over the past century and their experiences through different wars across Europe, and a cursed family hot chocolate recipe. It reminded me of like a cross between Gone with the Wind and 100 Years of Solitude. Yes, I seem to be making lots of Marquez references. This novel has so much to say about family, shifting politics, and the very direct impact that has on people's lives. I loved talking with the author and her translators about this novel, so I'll put a link to that down in the description below so you can have a watch if you haven't watched it already. Rainbow Milk by Paul Mendez. This novel primarily focuses on a young man named Jesse who grows up in the West Midlands and moves to London after leaving, actually being forced out of the Jehovah's Witness community that he was raised in. The way this author describes the character's strength as well as his vulnerability as he plunges into city life and discovers who he is as a black gay man is achingly beautiful. And it's also very moving the way the story circles back to past generation and connects with the heritage that he's been cut off from. Also, there are multiple references to the girl group The Sugar Babes that I've been thinking about and listening to again a lot because Keisha Buchanan recently started a YouTube channel and I am hooked. Minor Detail by Adania Shibli and translated by Elisabeth Jaquette. I have some very long books on my list, but this novel, like Weather, is a masterclass in how much an author can say in a very short space. So the first half of this novel concerns a young Palestinian woman who's captured by Israeli soldiers in the desert in 1948, and she is raped and murdered by them, but we don't actually see this. We more get like glimpses of it through the perspective of a commander who's suffering from a poisonous bite. And the second half of the novel concerns a woman many years later who is following up and finding more about this woman's story when it only gets a very brief mention in a much larger article. The way their two stories connect through sensory images is so moving and powerful and says so much about the way victim stories get lost in the larger pages of history. Night, Sleep, Death, the Stars by Joyce Carol Oates. This novel begins with a racist act of police brutality, which is incredibly prescient given the recent Black Lives Matter protests in the wake of the horrendous real-life incident. This is the story of a family grieving for a patriarchal figure that dies as a consequence of confronting the police, the intensely felt loss of his widow, the way some of his children, in their misdirected anger, resort to bigotry, and how some of the other children are able to radically redefine their lives on their own terms. This is an epic story of American life as only Joyce Carol Oates can tell it. I'm still buzzing from excitement from being able to interview her recently about her literary life and this novel in particular, so I'll link that below as well in case you haven't watched it yet. The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett. This is the story of twin sisters who run away from their very small town in Louisiana in the 1950s before going on to lead very different lives from each other. So as light-skinned African-American women, one sister pretends that she's fully white and marries a white man, and the other sister marries a very dark-skinned man before eventually returning to their hometown. It's about the assumptions we make about each other, the brutal legacy of racism, and the many different ways that people reinvent themselves. This is such a skillfully constructed novel, and it says so much about the uneasy relationship we have to our constantly evolving sense of identity. The Mermaid of Black Conch by Monique Raffi. Yes, this novel has a mermaid at its center, but it's definitely not your typical fantasy Disney sort of story. A fisherman strikes up a relationship with a mermaid on a Caribbean island before she's captured by American tourists. It's a story about love, greed, betrayal, sex, and violence, but it also says something much larger about the history of colonialism. And it's so fascinating how it does this through the story of an indigenous woman who's cursed to dwell at the bottom of the sea. And the way the author describes her loneliness as she's dwelling at the bottom of the ocean, I felt like I was right there with her. So these are my favorite books so far. As always, it was difficult to choose because I've read many other great books this year, but I'd love to know your thoughts about any of these. If you've read these novels as well, if you want to discuss them in the comments below or on my blog, I'll put links to my full reviews of each book in the description below. But also let me know, what are some of your favorite books that you've read this year? What am I missing out on? What do I need to catch up on? Let me know. Thank you for watching, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye, everyone.